All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Striding Past the 6-Minute Walk Test, Complementing Physical Activity Assessment with a Consensus Set of Digital Clinical Measures. My name is Candice Tegibau, and I am the program lead for the Physical Activity Project, led by the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. We do have a jam-packed agenda for today. I'll start by giving some background on the project. Then I'll pass it over to Bray Patrick Lake for opening remarks. We'll present some early findings, move into a multi-stakeholder workshop, multi-stakeholder panel, and hopefully have time for a question and answer period. A little bit about DIME. We are a global non-for-profit dedicated to advancing the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and improve lives. We sit at the intersection of healthcare and technology, and by leveraging our growing community of experts, DIME has been able to lead research at an accelerated pace, providing resources such as the Playbook, which outline guidance for developing and deploying digital measures in clinical care and clinical research. Which brings us to this project, which is the third demonstration of the Playbook in action. As many of us can recognize, physical activity is such an important indicator of health for virtually all therapeutic areas. And currently, the gold standards for measuring it are in-clinic assessments such as the 6-minute walk test. But early on in this project, there was a recognition that these discrete measures may not fully capture physical activity in contexts that are actually meaningful to patients. Instead, there's an opportunity to leverage digital health technologies, which can measure physical activity in daily life and complement those traditional assessments with higher resolution data. That being said, with more than 70 digital endpoints currently being used for physical activity, there is also a need to move away from innovating in silos and towards collaboration. So in response, DIME is convening this pre-competitive collaboration to develop a core set of digital measures for physical activity that matter to patients across therapeutic areas. A note that our method for this project is consistent with FDA's patient-focused drug development guidances and best practices for digital measurement development. First, we explore meaningful aspects of health. For example, that includes qualitative studies with patients exploring in their own words, what aspects of physical activity do patients not want to become worse, want to improve, or want to maintain? Then once we organize that patient input into meaningful aspects of health, we identify health concepts or concepts of interest related to those aspects that can be practically measured. And only after these first two steps are we able to define digital outcomes for physical activity. Currently, we are halfway through this project, and what we'll be sharing today are early findings from a systematic review of qualitative studies among patients. We'll be highlighting the first two steps of this model, where we've identified meaningful aspects of health and proposed some relevant concepts of interest. We are also guided by the ICF framework, which helps us understand the interplay and relationship between functional impairment, activity limitations, participation restrictions, and how they're influenced by personal and environmental factors. And so briefly, the questions our project team aimed to answer with the systematic review of qualitative studies were twofold. First, what concepts of physical activity are globally meaningful to patients and their healthcare providers? And secondly, under what context are they meaningful? And I've included a QR code here if you're interested in the details of that protocol, including our eligibility criteria and our methodology. But in broad strokes, our first step was to conduct a multi-stakeholder workshop to explore pathways forward for our project. We developed a protocol, had 2 independent reviewers screen around 3,600 papers from 5 databases, did a full text review, and conducted qualitative coding of around the 100 articles that were ultimately included. Our sample of therapeutic areas for this review included Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, COPD, cancer, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, chronic heart failure, osteoarthritis, and sarcopenia. These therapeutic areas were chosen because they cover a broad range of diseases, but we had also considered disease prevalence, conditions where digital endpoints are already being used for physical activity, and the degree of qualitative studies available in the literature. We are mindful that there are conditions in this sample over others where more qualitative research has been conducted, but the themes and the concepts that we'll be sharing later today were common across most, if not all, therapeutic areas represented. And finally, I want to emphasize that we're presenting initial study findings today, and we welcome input from experts and invite you to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions for the project team. But before we get into the meat of our findings, let me first welcome Bray to introduce herself and give us some opening remarks.
Hi, Candace, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here for a variety of reasons. So first, this is my first talk from the side of actually being an FDA employee. And I think this is like just such the perfect group for me to be engaged with today. I've been following this work over many years, and just to see it come to fruition and to actually be sitting in a session where we can actually look at some of the initial findings in such a patient-centered body of work is really, really exciting to me. So I do now work at the Digital Health Center of Excellence, and we're in the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. And our group was formed in 2020, and we do work across centers and try to align and coordinate our digital health work across the FDA. So something else that's really exciting and being part of a DIME event for me is that this work in my office, we very much focus on collaborations. And so we're trying to empower stakeholders to advance healthcare by fostering responsible and high quality digital health innovation. And how you do that is through connecting and building partnerships and forming groups like these and sharing knowledge and really increasing the awareness and understanding of our tools across digital health and driving synergy to advance the best practices. And when we do that, we can innovate on our regulatory approaches and start to provide efficient and least burdensome oversight while still meeting the standards of FDA for safe and effective products, and of course, taking patient-centered approaches, which again, I'll mention that I just love about this program in particular. So I still remember when the playbook, was first brought out, and we had the library of crowdsourced endpoints that DIME put up. And at first it had like almost nothing in it. And over the years, it got really exciting as you're just watching it blossom from, here's 7, here's 8, here's hundreds of measures. And from the patient side too, like that's really exciting. And then I think we all started to realize, wow, now we've got 50, 60, 70 measures of the same thing. And for those of you that were part of the launch of the playbook many years ago, I think there's a quote that has just stuck with me. A heartbeat is a heartbeat, and companies need to come together, and we need to just crystallize this field because that's what's best for patients. So here it is. It's like a living example. Now we've got people who are actually doing that for physical activity. And I think it's important to know that, this is going to help streamline everything and really help, I think, even at the agency become more efficient. The agency is really keeping a forward look and keeping our eye out for the deluge of digital health submissions that are coming in. And so anything that we can do to support standards and to make sure that regulatory pathways are predictable and build catalogs of tools that have been evaluated at a high quality standard in certain contexts of use, and that really sponsors and companies can pick up off the shelf, that's going to be the best thing for all of us. We don't want people wasting their finite resources redoing methodological work. And so again, I just commend this group for pulling together and taking that approach. And with that, I'm just super excited to sit back and enjoy the rest of the webinar and learn more about the findings.
Thank you so much, Bray. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and look forward to collaborating with the FDA in the future.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have Selma join us now for a presentation of our findings. So let me go back to present my screen.
Thank you very much, Candice. And I'm very pleased today to share with you the early findings from the project team. Basically, this is the initial findings from this systematic literature review. And as Candice mentioned earlier, this is early findings and they will be refined further as we go through the project. But it will be very good to have this starting point and have your comments and from the community as well to help us basically further refine and get to a sensible list of core measures in physical activity. So when we did review the full sample of qualitative articles across the different TAs, the key meaningful aspects of health that came up were really very much related to how impairment restricted participation in activities of daily living of the patients, mainly around community and leisure, based on the ICF framework, self-care and domestic activities. So those are really the key areas that came up from the qualitative papers that have been reviewed. So we tried as well to summarize all these meaningful aspects of health in 3 buckets. So a key one was around ambulation and the lower extremity function. Then we have the upper extremity functions around the arm and usage of the hand. And then we have the bending and changing of body position, like if you think about from sitting to standing and other basically positional changes. So what we did next, following the same model that Candice introduced earlier, is for each of these meaningful aspects of health, we identified measurable health concepts that can be measured digitally. It is not in scope for today, but as next steps, we'll also look at further basically going in deep dives of these concepts and have specific measures that are linked to it. As mentioned also earlier, we did use the ICF framework as a guiding principle in terms of developing these frameworks. So for each of these health concepts, we also thought about what type of disease symptoms and functional impairments that, personal and environmental factor can influence the concept of interest. In addition, the concept that we identified, we also find out that independence emerged as a key theme across all therapeutic areas and that are important to patients. So patients really wanted to improve how they freely take care of themselves, how they can do their chores, how can they move around in the community. So independence was a very key important aspect to patients. Quality of life was also very much reflected, and the patients felt some limitation in terms of engaging in pleasurable or enjoyable activities like socializing, playing sports, or volunteering in the community. And all these were grouped as activities related to daily living. So on the next slide, we will basically just give you an illustration of the conceptual model. So please keep in mind, this is very much illustrative and it's very much based on the quality studies that we reviewed, but it just gives us like a good structure that we will follow going forward. So for example, if we start with the concept, the meaningful aspects of health of ambulation, it's very much linked to the aspects that are important to patients for community and leisure activities. For example, the ability of patients to go around in the shop, to walk in the garden, to walk along the beach, and to avoid falling and make sure they keep their balance. It's also related to their interpersonal relationship in terms of their ability to socialize, go to social events, walk with friends, and also domestic activities in terms of walking at home, doing their chores, and going up the stairs. There were some aspects as well that we may think may be relevant, but didn't come up necessarily in these quality studies, mainly around work and schooling. But that's something as well we can think of as we refine further the model. Then related to these meaningful aspects of health, there are 4 key concepts that emerge. So there are walking behaviors, and that includes walking capacity, and then also it has different aspects of walking as the intensity, the frequency and the duration that can be measured. For example, an illustrative outcome of walking behavior can be the moderate to vigorous physical activity, which basically counts the number of bouts spent in MVPA lasting a certain number of minutes. So in addition to the walking behavior, lower limb strength came up as a strong concept from the qualitative studies, walking speed, and postural sway. And here postural sway is very much related to balance, and we can think about it in terms of potential measures can be the sway area or the length of postural sway. So if we go to the next slide, now what we will do is we will cover the conceptual model of the three meaningful aspects of health that we introduced earlier, starting from ambulation and really looking at some quotes from the patients and what they did report. So again, with regards to ambulation, the patient described important aspects of physical activity, specifically around walking outside and walking to the store. So here we have some key quotes with regards in terms of their ability to go to the shop, because they cannot go anymore to the shop because they cannot walk. So this is an example from a chronic heart failure patient. They could not leave, go to places because they could not walk well. They had to cancel some events, so that also links back to their ability to socialize as well. That's related to some MS patients. As well as basically, as mentioned, it's also limited their participation with regard to social and relationship building activities. So if we go then to the next slide. So this is the conceptual model in line with the ICF framework we introduced. So related to the meaningful aspects of health, which is ambulation, we have the four key health concepts that we identified. And we see here that the key symptoms linked to this health concept are pain, fatigue, muscle weakness, and breathlessness. In terms of functional impairments, what came up, and this is very much taking on the terminology from ICF, because we try to organize them in a way that can be used interchangeably across different areas, was the lack of power and also mainly in the lower body, which related to muscle functioning, the lack of supportive function of the legs, gait impairment, mobility of joint functions, lack of stability of the joint functions, and also lack of exercise tolerance. In terms of contextual factors, the key barriers that came up were very much personal and environmental, and patients express being self-conscious about their walking, grieving their loss of independence, the independence we mentioned earlier, and basically their fear of falling can also decrease their confidence to continue walking, and that can impact their behavior long-term. In terms of facilitators, so the patients usually get some coping mechanisms, so they can either get some social support from their family or friends, as well as using some walking aids or encouraging patients to continue walking in the community. So this is like a very much illustrative and starting conceptual model that we can use for ambulation specifically, that we can further refine as we further develop our model. Then if we go to the next slide, we will cover in this case the upper extremity function. Here again, according to the qualitative studies we reviewed, it was very much linked to community and leisure activities, mainly the ability of patient to use their upper body in sport and lifting a paintbrush to do their leisure activity like painting. In terms of self-care is their ability to lift a hairbrush, washing their hair, lifting their basically eating like knife and forks. And in terms of also of domestic activities, in terms of taking care of their house and themselves, in terms of cleaning the dishes, and also carrying the laundry basket. And we can see this very much illustrated in the quote we have here. So for example, here we have an example from Duchenne patients where they said the arm weakness was a real problem for me because I cannot reach for a lot of things that I would like to reach for. I can get frustrated in terms of having somebody help me. So basically it's linked to the lack of independence. We have another here quote from an MS patient, where basically it's related to self-care activities. My arms get really tired, and I can't wash my hair without taking breaks because my arms get very tired. And again, we have from a breast cancer patient, I'll go quickly to the quote here. It's like, in terms of the ability to, my physical strength is gone. I used to be able to lift pretty heavy stuff, and now it's like lifting a hairbrush. I'm so tired that it's difficult. So again, similarly to previously, we illustrated that in a conceptual model in the next slide. And here, related to upper extremity function, we identified two key health concepts. So there is the upper limb range of motion. And as we've seen from the quotes, some clear, basically, a concept came up, is really lifting the ability to use the full arm range of motion, as well as the hands, to be able to hold things. But we can also think about shoulders and neck, but that's something that didn't came up in those quotes, but we can further refine. And also the upper limb strength. And the symptoms that were linked to this concept were fatigue and muscle weakness, really the ability of using the muscle in terms of the different range of motion. In terms of functional impairments, what came up, again, very much linked to the muscle weakness, was lack of power in the body, lack of supportive functions of the arm, and mobility of joint functions. In terms of contextual factors, in terms of barrier, they were very much personal in this case. So patients grieved the loss of independence and expressed their frustration and sometimes refusing help. In terms of facilitators, again, is very much environmental, where partners and family members help with self-care and domestic activities. Then if we go to the last meaningful aspects of health, which was around bending and changing of body position. Here again, it was very much linked to self-care activities based on the qualitative studies we reviewed around dressing oneself, cleaning the body, legs and feet, and domestic activities around loading the dishwasher, making the bed, picking things up. Here again, we have some quotes that were related to this specific meaningful aspects of health. Where the patient expressed the fear of getting down to where I can't live by myself. The vacuum cleaner dewinded me, sweeping is just as bad, I can't bend over. To grab dishes out of the dishwasher is, if I keep on doing the bending and standing motion, that's hard. So again, it's very much the ability to bend, to sit up straight, all these basically concepts were expressed as limitations as well by the patients. And if we go to the next slide. So for related to the meaningful aspects of health of bending and changing body position, the key health concept was the full body range of motion. And by full body, we mean the areas like the hip range of motion, the spinal and thoracic range of motions. And with regard to the symptom linked to this health concept was fatigue, muscle weakness, breathlessness, and in terms of functional impairments, similarly to what we've seen for the upper muscle strength, was the lack of power related to tone, endurance of all muscles in the body, in this case, because it covers all body range of motions, lack of supportive function of the arms. In terms of contextual factors, the barriers here were again very personal. Patients described frustration with the loss of independence, the feeling of helplessness, and no longer desire to go out because of functional impairments. And in terms of facilitator, again, we've seen, as we've seen before, it's really the help that they get from partners and family members with regards to their self-care and domestic activities. So this is basically the high-level summary from the initial work that we've conducted. In terms of, as we've seen, in terms of consideration, we have now a good starting point, evidence-based concept for physical activity that are common across different therapeutic areas that we can use to further refine for specific indication based on the patient population and the context of use. And we are very much mindful that this concept can be influenced by the full patient experience and also sometimes by behavior as well. It's very much linked to the disease progression and also the effects of treatment. And we've seen sometimes in cases where, although the treatment may improve the physical activity, the behaviors that the patient have taken may still limit the measures. So that's something we also need to investigate further and take into account in the next step of the project. In terms of next steps, we will do further data analysis and we will start the manuscript writing for the publication that we aim to publish for the SLR. We'll also define a core set of digital clinical measures for physical activity. And we will conduct a subsequent systematic review to define all the ontologies of the measures and really developing a core set that can be used by the community and the related resources that go with it. So thank you very much for joining us today for this finding, and I will hand it over to Candice.
Thank you so much, Salma, for bringing us through the findings very brilliantly. I see that there are some questions on our question and answer period or question and answer chat. I'll get to some of those, but we'll have some time at the end to also ask some questions. So if you have any additional queries that you have for our presenters, please type it in the chat. But next, we'll move on to a multi-stakeholder panel. I'll stop sharing and invite Alan, who will be moderating our session today, to come onto the screen.
Great, thanks, Candice, and thank you, Candice and the DIME team for inviting me to be the moderator of this multi-stakeholder panel. So we have 4 panelists joining us today. I'll introduce myself and then the 4 panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. So as Candice says, my name is Alan Hamilton. I'm Senior Director of Research with the COPD Foundation. And one of my specific tasks within the foundation is as project lead for an initiative called Pivot, which stands for Patient-Inspired Validation of Outcome Tools. So very relevant to the topic that the physical activity topic that we're talking about today. So to just briefly introduce the panelists, we have Kieran Reed. Kieran is the director of the Laboratory of Exercise Physiology and Physical Performance at Brigham and Women's Hospital at the Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts. Elena Ismailova is the Chief Scientific Officer at Connexa Health in New York, a leader in digital biomarkers for clinical trials in the tech sector and pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries. We also have Eric Mangin, who is the Director in Global Digital Analytics and Technologies at Merck, a global research-intensive biopharmaceutical company from West Point, Pennsylvania. And finally, we have Astrid Horstman, who is a specialist in nutrition and muscle physiology at Nestle Research based in Lausanne in Switzerland. So welcome to all the panelists. So to start off with, our first discussion point is going to focus on traditional measurements related to physical activity. And as Candice mentioned earlier, in-clinic assessments such as the 6-minute walk test are traditionally the go-to standard to measure physical function in many disease. So I'm going to bring in Kieran and Astrid to discuss points related to these in-clinic assessments. So first of all, Kieran, if you could speak to some of the challenges and issues related to the episodic clinical assessment for physical activity, and then we'll follow on with Astrid, who will comment on how digital physical activity outcomes can help to overcome some of these challenges. So Kieran, if you'd like to start off.
Thank you, Alan. I think this is a really kind of critical question, and I think we can consider really several challenges or issues with our current in-clinic assessment model. And really, I see them from both a scientific or theoretical perspective, or really a more practical or a measurement perspective. Firstly, our typical clinic-based approaches have historically relied on a interpretation of a test really performed on a single clinic visit or performance of a single individual test. And really think we should really question, and we have, and this is the purpose of our endeavor here, really how representative this approach really is in ultimately capturing how a patient may actually be living or functioning in their own environments on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, for example. And secondly, I think it's an important point is that our current in-clinic standards have often relied a little bit too heavily on off-the-shelf assessments. And what I mean by that specifically is that, for example, like tests like the 6-minute walk or 400-meter walk or different function tests, they're often used in studies or clinical trials or clinical applications, often because they've been the most commonly used or previously used approaches. And why this is important is because these have often been used sometimes with really minimal or less regard for what actually the test is measuring or what aspect of health or functioning that particular assessment is measuring. Is it of importance to the patient? And also, and quite importantly, will the actual intervention or treatment impact that endpoint? In other words, sometimes these endpoints are not linked appropriately to the indication, or sometimes the actual mechanism or proposed mechanism of action of a treatment or an actual intervention. And lastly, the point I'd like to really make about measurement or practical perspectives about function assessment and activity assessment in clinic. To really do them well, you have to have rigorous oversight of assessors and rigorous training. And if that doesn't happen, it can really impact the validity, reliability, reproducibility of the measures that are being used in the clinic. And often it's not just possible, not feasible to really have rigorous oversight of these in-clinic assessments. And this can really hamper the interpretability of findings, test findings, study findings, and often this is after a substantial outlay of effort and resources.
Great, thanks, Kieran. And maybe then passing over to Astrid. And Astrid, could you comment on how, with what Kieran said as background, how can digital physical activity outcomes help us to overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen and Kieran. First of all, I think it's with the digital measures, we can focus more on the meaningful aspects of health. So not just maybe on one function, but combine more functions, as we heard in the introduction. So really more patient-important endpoints related to physical activity. And then secondly, there's also continuous monitoring possible. Like Kieran said, it's not just one moment that we have a person in the clinic and that can have a good or a bad day, but it's more an average, and we can capture variability and also patterns or dynamics of physical activity as opposed to this episodic measurement. Then also it would allow for real-time feedback, which can also really increase the engagement and the motivation of the people involved, I think. And then lastly, and also very important, it can also be transferred more easily if we use digital measures to be performed in settings outside a clinic. For instance, at home, or as we saw in the beginning, walking around a shop or in a garden or with friends, and there is no direct face-to-face a physiotherapist is needed because the digital measures can give the feedback already by themselves. So these are some of the aspects that we think that measuring physical activity digitally can really complement the current episodic clinical measures.
Great, thanks, Esther, and thanks, Kieran. Just shifting a little bit now to the current project, and we'd like to focus now on activities that are being conducted within the DIME physical activity project. So in the process of identifying the concepts of physical activity, the so-called what to measure, we started by exploring what patients say is meaningful to them. And we've done this as shown earlier by a systematic review of qualitative studies. So one could ask, why is it important that we put patients at the heart of digital outcomes development? And we're very fortunate to have Elena on the panel. And Elena has kindly agreed to share her story of measuring her physical activity after receiving an anti-cancer treatment and what she has learned from it. So Elena, really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Today, I would like to highlight 3 aspects of the question that Alan just posed, why it's important to hear from patients. Number one, often we make our own assumptions of what it takes to live with a certain conditions and what patients will and won't do based on our knowledge and our experience. Second, I would like to emphasize why physical activity assessments done in clinic are not equivalent to what people do at home in their natural environment. And I will give you a somewhat paradoxical example. And also, I would like to emphasize why it's important to hear directly from patients to understand how to interpret digital data that may come from digital health technologies, because the voice of patients is critical for data interpretation. Here is my story. I received a diagnosis of suspected cancer through routine screening. I didn't expect it at all because I had no symptoms and I had no risk factors. It was a diagnosis of suspected colorectal cancer that I received during my first colonoscopy. And the patient journey ahead of me was the tumor removal surgically, waiting for pathology that would give me a prognosis and determine whether I needed additional treatments like chemotherapy. I knew that the journey ahead of me would not be easy, and I decided to monitor myself because I knew that monitoring physical activity would be important. I learned this from my long-term collaborator, Dr. Nitin Ori, who is an oncologist at Bronx Medical Center. Dr. Ori is a radiation oncologist, and he drives digital innovation in oncology healthcare. Patients who come to his office to start radio or chemoradiotherapy have an option to receive a fitness tracker. It's a lightweight device, very easy to use, that people can wear for weeks. And Dr. Ori collected data on hundreds of patients. What we learned from his research that patients who are physically inactive are much more likely to get hospitalized during anti-cancer therapies, and specifically patients with locally advanced lung cancers who are inactive, judging on their daily step count adjusted for age, have much worse outcomes in terms of survival and hospitalization rate. So I baselined myself before heading to the hospital for 10 days. I went for my surgery, and just in case if you are worried at me, I'm doing fine. The surgery went well. I recovered. My prognosis is good. The only thing that is remaining is frequent cancer screening. The next one is tomorrow. Please wish me luck. But overall, I'm doing fine. So, and I started monitoring myself as soon as I was discharged from the hospital. When I looked at my daily step count, the same variable as Dr. Ori is researching, I saw that my first daily count at home was 313 steps. This is extremely low. When I was in the hospital knew that encouraging patients to walk was important. And the nurses recorded my walking on the whiteboard in my room so I can see it, and told me that I need to continue walking. And I'm sure in the hospital, my daily step count was much higher. Why? Because it was in the hospital. The hospital had a long hallway with no obstacles where I can go back and forth and I can ask a nurse for assistance. I could also use my IV stand as a walking aid. When I got home, I had no walking aid. I have a small house with a bunch of obstacles like doors and stairs. And let me tell you that walking after abdominal surgery is extremely painful, even on painkillers. something I would never have anticipated. But once I saw my step count from my first day at home, I realized I have to do something about it. And I asked for help from my caregivers to help me walking, my husband and my daughter who were taking care of me. And the next day, it was already 2,000 steps. So it was doable. As I looked at my daily step counts and I saw an increase, I was confident enough to walk outside and not being constrained by my house. When I fully recovered and returned to work, I shared my own data with my fellow data scientist, Dr. Robert Ellis, and together we analyzed my data, which is published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, Clinical Cancer Information. If you want to see more details, I will send you the link in the chat. We were able to interpret my data because I kept my own patient diary, and we were able to develop a model that predicts with 80% accuracy the dates when I was unwell. I will conclude. I hope I convinced you this is why it is important to hear directly from patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and really very inspiring. I think having been a scientist in this area for many years and having, if you like, indirectly appreciated the patient lived experience from qualitative research, I think it is truly inspiring to have someone who is a member of our team who can also, as a bridge, if you like, this between the science and the patient lived experience. So thank you very much for sharing that story. So next on the agenda, I'd like to now open it up to all of the panel just to talk a little bit about our experience of collaborating and contributing to the recent rounds of discussions that have taken place within this project to identify physical activity concepts that are aligned with the patient qualitative data. So I'll just go around the table, if you like, and ask each of you just to give a brief comment on the experience you've had so far, and maybe things that you've learned, things that you were surprised to see, and the nature of that collaborative experience that we've been through and we are going through. So maybe Eric, we haven't heard from you yet, so maybe I'll start with you, Eric.
Yeah, it's been great to work with the cross-functional group. I think representing the pharmaceutical industry, we're focused on how digital measures can help make decision-making for therapeutics. So really, I know there was FDA involvement here as well, which is great. So helping us look towards standardizing digital measures that can be leveraged for decision-making within clinical trials is going to be tremendous, especially as Kieran highlighted some of the, the limitations that we see in clinic assessments. So moving past that is really something that we're looking forward to.
Great, thanks, Eric. And maybe Astrid, turn to you next.
Yeah, here it holds a little bit the same. We're representing the nutritional industry. I would say that we're also looking for sensitive measures that respond to nutritional interventions, and also really putting the patient at the center and going there with personalized nutrition. It's really nice. And as Eric said, it's really nice to work with a group of people with different backgrounds, and discuss these points.
Great, thanks, Astrid. And Kieran, maybe you could add your thoughts and experience.
Yeah, the one thing I really like about this project is the speed of progress, and the way we're able to really try collectively and decipher a very complex, interrelated, dynamic endeavor across multiple patient populations. And a lot of us are focused on different aspects such as aging or COPD, and which have very different but sometimes related aspects that we're discussing. But I like the fact that it always comes back to the individual. It always comes back to what's important to the patient, rather than what we think is important to either an investigator who's trying to figure out a clinical trial or something. That the kind of the benchmark each time is that it brings us back to what's actually meaningful for the person.
Great. And Elena, on this, maybe last word from you on your
Yes, my main discovery was how consistent the findings are across multiple indications with very different disease features, and how people put forward what is really important to them and how it can guide future research. What I learned in this project actually resonates very well with my own experience as a patient.
Great, thanks, Elena. Thanks everybody for those thoughts and insights. And just to finish off with, we're going to take a little bit of a peek into the future. And as we all can see, and I think we've all experienced, digital technology is really evolving at a rapid pace, and really an accelerating pace, I would say, over the last few years. So maybe Eric, could you give us some thoughts on where do you see the future of digital measurement of physical activity in both clinical trials and clinical practice?
Yeah, thanks. So the implementation of digital technologies in pharmaceutical clinical trials, especially for measurement of physical activity, it's a bit like running a race where there's bumps along the way, there's hurdles to overcome. And at Merck, we are still not at the finish line of that race. I see two main challenges currently. The first is operational complexity. When you have large-scale clinical trials, the last thing a clinical team wants is one more sort of hurdle, one more barrier to enrollment, one more step for the clinical site to make. So the more we can smooth those hurdles for the clinical sites, I think the more we'll see uptake of these digital technologies. One of the other challenges I see is currently some uncertainty in the digital measure outcome. And I really think that's where this organization and work stream can be helpful in that, you know, we did mention how poor some of the in-clinic assessments are, but the clinical teams are comfortable with them. They've been using them for years. So while there are drawbacks to a 6-minute walk test, someone who's running a clinical trial goes, I've been doing this for years. I know it works, even if there are drawbacks. So I think moving past that and being able to highlight the need for more momentary assessments and more patient, patient-centric measures is really something that we can push towards. So these are just some of the hurdles we face. There are more, but I definitely think the clear benefits of digital measures for physical activity, stand on their own, especially when, as mentioned, the gold standards are not quite as pure gold as we'd like to see them. So we all know digital measures allow for more patient-centric, more true to life, more frequent measurements, which can enable better decision-making in clinical trials, which ultimately, for what we're looking for here at Merck, is what we're looking for is better decision-making to impact patients' lives, and better assessments of those meaningful aspects of health. And I think these digital measures are, the future of how we'll get there.
Great, thanks, Eric, and thanks to all the panelists. And just before I hand back to Candice, just maybe one final thought from my side. And I think it's very, very important that I think in the title of this webinar, and something that we've discussed a lot, and it was brought up in the introduction, is this idea of how can digital health technology measures of physical activity complement other measures. And I think that idea of complementing is really important, that as we look to the future, we're not looking to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, and say that the other measures are not important. But I think by this focus on the key differentiating between what to measure and how to measure, I think we can then hopefully in the future really look how all these different clinical outcome assessment tools, such as PROs, digital health technology, performance outcomes, how they can all complement each other. And I think by focusing on what they're actually measuring and how that relates to the meaningful aspects of health for patients, I think that'll lead us to a bright future where we have more precision in how we are measuring and also how we are interpreting those measurements. So I just want to once again thank all the panelists for joining today. Thank you, Candice, for inviting us, and hand back to you.
All right, thank you so much. We'll ask you to stay with your cameras on as we get into a question and answer period. We'll bring back Salma as well to come and join us. I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar, but also in this project. It's been an absolute pleasure to collaborate with you all and to sort of see the trees in the forest, if you will. A first question we have from the audience was, how does age and disease severity interact with the findings that we presented today? And so, I'll respond shortly and then go to some of our panelists and presenters if you have any additional input. But, we were mindful as a research team that patient responses were influenced by things like age and disease progression. Our sample included patient responses across a variety of ages. So we have therapeutic areas such as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, chronic heart failure, and other diseases that cover a range of ages, and also sarcopenia on the other end. We also intentionally coded in our qualitative manual for disease progression. And what we had observed, but we need to really get into the data a little bit more, is that folks in early stage of their disease, when they talked about participation restriction in activities, they were very much related to social activities, not being able to leave the home, go for a walk with a friend, join a tennis club, or walk in a golf course. And then as we got into more later stages of disease progression, a lot of the responses that were meaningful were related to instrumental activities of daily living. So can I reach in a cupboard for a cup, or can I put a plate and bend down to my dishwasher? A lot of self-care activities, such as not being able to or having a difficult time reaching above your head to wash your hair. And so we did observe differences based on disease progression, and definitely that's something that we're considering. But I want to toss this back to you, Alan. Even in your work in COPD, do you have any response related to differences in physical function and what's meaningful to patients based on their disease progression?
Yeah, thanks, Candice. I think COPD is probably a good representative example of a chronic disease, and here we're talking about a chronic lung disease. And I think one aspect of that is you've got the primary manifestation of the disease, which would be loss in lung function and the breath that's associated with that. Then you also have the secondary consequences. The secondary consequences being as a result of the activity limitation and actually stopping doing the activity, then you have non-systemic kind of problems arising, such as in skeletal muscle. And I think this does mean that there's a progression of the disease which can amplify the activity limitation. One thing we probably need to be cognizant of with the qualitative research is, have we actually explored in enough detail probably some of those earlier disease? Because I think in general, the qualitative research would have been done on the more severe. So I think we probably should look at that and say, are we truly identifying all the necessary? So have we reached saturation, if you like, in early disease? So I think probably at this moment, we probably have some indications, but that might be an area for us to either explore ourselves or offer that as an opportunity for others to explore, is to look for saturation effects in early disease.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments from panelists? Salma?
Yeah, maybe just to say as well, I think that was also one of the considerations we mentioned in the finding is we may have to do like more specific work in terms of running patient interviews to specifically and across different severity stages of the disease to better understand the concept, because it will vary very much on the indication, on the patient population. So this is, I think, as a very good starting point, but there will still be some further work to do to refine it further at the indication and patient population level as well. That's also some of the consideration and ways to go around that as well.
Mm-hmm. And something that you mentioned and following up on that is we were mindful to have a sample that reflected a range of therapeutic areas, but in our discussion, in our rounds of stakeholder engagement, we did discuss that differences within a population and between populations are important. And so, there might be some symptoms or functional impairments that might be different across therapeutic areas. But what we also emphasize and what we highlighted is that there is a commonality in the way patients describe activity limitation and concepts that are important to them across therapeutic areas. And so a focus that our project has is, how do we leverage that commonality? And, at the end of this project, once we define a core set of digital clinical measures for physical activity, they still need to be validated for folks to use depending on their population, depending on their context of use. But what we're trying to do here is give people a starting point and to define a few measures that there's evidence that they're meaningful to patients so that folks don't need to reinvent the wheel every time they want to measure physical activity. And maybe Eric, I'll ask you a question as well, like in your experience in clinical trials and using different types of physical activity endpoints, what is your sort of experience in, coming to a clinical trial and wanting to measure physical activity?
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it previously. I think early on we get a lot of engagement from the clinical team, and they see the value of it. We have had a couple teams that have gotten to the point where we put it in the protocol, and then when it comes to operationalizing the study, they already have too many assessments, too many things that the clinic's doing, and for some reason or another, digital doesn't make the cut. So we have seen that a couple times. We are seeing momentum where more from the ground level, the team is going, we need a way to better measure, and we've talked about this a lot. So I think we're seeing that movement and push from the ground up, and I'm really hopeful that I think in the next 2-3 years we'll really start to see a lot of uptake in some of these digital technologies.
Alan?
Yeah, I just want to actually build on from what Eric says. So before joining the CPD Foundation, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 25 years, and for a lot of that time, what I noticed was if digital measures were included, so I think a lot of experiences, as Eric said, of being an idea, but then kind of got lost in the shuffle and didn't actually make it to the trial. When it did traditionally get put into the trial, it tended to be put in as a so-called exploratory endpoint. And I think what we're all heading to in the future is actually having these digital measures actually identified as primary endpoints. But that's the holy grail. I think what would be good is to plot a pathway between the exploratory to the primary. So what are those steps you need to take in terms of including in clinical trials, such as like secondary, key secondary, put it into hierarchical testing strategies? Because I think we stayed too long in that exploratory type of thing. And I think this project will help us to move towards that, finally having these identified as primary endpoints in clinical trials, in phase 3 types of clinical trials.
Absolutely. Elena?
I would like to elaborate a little bit further on what just Alan said, that I think we are on a good path just to make it there in this middle ground where physical activity data can supplement and complement other endpoints. And I'm a firm believer that we will make it there because of very patient-centric nature of these measures.
Absolutely. I'm mindful that we are coming to the end of the hour. And so let me just take the time to thank all of the panelists for joining us today, all the presenters, and all your dedication into this work and to this project. And if for the audience, if you have any questions or any input that you would like to make or suggestions for our project team, feel free to reach out to this email. And again, thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day. And